So it's crypto week in Congress. The House is considering the Genius Act, which is going to regulate stablecoins. So one of the provisions there is that it's going to require investment in certain U.S. treasuries. Do you think this is the key to solving all of
It's
America's
going to
national
solve
debt
all the. It's going to
problems?
solve all the problems. It's going to solve all the problems. No, man. Look, it's interesting. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? Crypto is always this is one of the few areas where my very dear friend and partner Peter Schiff and I disagree. Peter loves just shitting all over crypto, and I don't. I think crypto is eminently useful, and I think it's a fantastic asset class. To me, anything that disrupts the banking system is a good idea. The banking system is so bad. It's just bad. It's terrible. Very few people ever really have like a banking experience like, wow, that was really great. What a pleasant use of my time that was. It's just horrible, right? Opening an account, closing an account, sending money, all these things, these very, very basic things. And when you think about all the different functions and industries in the world that our human civilization really relies on, there's only a handful of them, right? I mean, with food, energy, finance. I mean, these are transportation. These are some of the most essential elements of human civilization. Most of these things are really impressive in the way when you think about, people that have to drill for oil and gas and all those sorts of things. I mean, the incredibly difficult things that they have to do and to get that stuff out of the ground and move it thousands of miles and put it in form of gasoline or electricity and all that. It's so seamless and hardly anybody on the planet even knows how it works. And we don't need to because it all works so well. Finance is a thing that we see as one of those critical functions, and it's so bad. It's so bad. So anything that it's bureaucratic, it's cumbersome, it's inefficient. It takes days and days to send money and all this stuff. It's still giving people satchels full of cash on the Pony Express to ride on horseback across the countryside. Every time you send an international transfer and some bank goes, oh, it'll take 3 to 5 days for the money to get there, and I'm like, are you putting it on a boat? Is this on a ship? And you're gonna, it's ridiculous. And so anything that disrupts that is a good idea. And crypto very heavily disrupts that. Crypto gives you a sense where you can be your own banker. You don't need a middleman anymore between you and your money. You don't need any of that stuff. And I think it's great. I think the way the government is looking at this from the Genius Act, and I kind of wrote about this. Maybe genius is a strong word. I'm not sure the Genius Act is genius, but I think it might actually be pretty clever. And what they're ultimately trying to do, the U.S. government needs money. I don't know if you notice this or not, but I mean, when you're running multi-trillion-dollar deficits every year now, you need cash. You got to always come up with cash. And so where do they always get that money from? They used to go to foreign governments, foreign central banks, big corporations, domestic banks, and they would sell treasury bonds and treasury notes and T-bills at auction. And that's how they would, finance the deficit and increase the national debt every year. Well, now it turns out that there's all these, especially foreign governments and central banks, that are losing confidence in the United States government. They're losing confidence in U.S. government finances, and by extension, essentially the U.S. dollar. And so they're kind of moving away from treasuries now. Foreigners have less of an appetite to own and buy and invest in treasuries. So they got to make that up from somewhere. Well, where is there a bunch of money sort of sitting around that might not really be, invested or deployed anywhere, when they look at it and say, hey, crypto. And, Donald Trump had this magic, epiphany moment during the election where all of a sudden he got very extremely pro crypto because, of course, the crypto community was giving him lots and lots of money. So he'd become the most pro crypto politician in history up to this point. And he got lots and lots of crypto money and his meme coin and all this stuff. And I think what they're looking at now is saying, hey, there's a lot of money there. And we think about there's a couple $1 trillion that's sitting there, trillions of dollars that's sitting in crypto. And I think that politicians are looking at this saying, if we can divert some of that crypto money into stable coins and have those stable coins required to own U.S. government bonds, specifically in this case, the legislation requires them to own short-term U.S. government bonds. That's a great way to plug that gap, because say, man, we might lose $300 billion in money from the European Union and China that's not going to be coming into treasuries here. How are we going to make up for that? Well, they can go get that money from the stablecoin market now. right? And so that'd be money that comes sort of out of Bitcoin, out of maybe some altcoins, things like that, goes into these stable coins that are now being regulated by state governments and by the federal government. That would then be and then with those proceeds, they would have to buy treasuries. And that's now all of a sudden how the treasury is able to plug the gap to the tune of potentially hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Maybe even you get to a number that's in the trillions, right? So that's I think one of the things that could be very clever about this.
But you're saying that stablecoins could also be a disruption to the banking system and improve it in some way?
Well, just about anything could be an improvement to the banking system. I think it's actually quite interesting that in some respects, so if all of a sudden there were, and this is going to happen, okay, so the Genius Act creates a regulatory framework for basically anybody to go and start their own stablecoin. And if it's below a certain threshold, if the market cap of your stablecoin is below a certain threshold, you can be regulated at your state level, and which is cool, because what that means is exactly what the founding fathers intended, is that all the states are going to be in competition with each other. So states will immediately set off this sort of land rush for every state to try and create their own their own stablecoin regulatory framework to become, like we're the cool state. Maybe it'll be Wyoming, maybe it'll be Florida. We're the best state to set up your stablecoin in. And if you're above a certain threshold, then you become regulated at the federal level. But the idea is across the board that if you create a stablecoin, so somebody says, okay, I'm going to have, my one token, my Joe token is going to be worth $1. It's your responsibility as the stablecoin issuer to maintain that. And so they give you these requirements and these regulations. Here's how you do that. Here's what you're supposed to do. So people go and they give you all these dollars in exchange for your token. What are you allowed? What you can and cannot do with all those dollars that people give you? So you've got $100 million in stablecoin, $100 million backing it on the other side with US dollars and US dollar assets. What are those US dollar assets that you can have that are backing your stablecoin? Well, they're saying it includes things like specifically short-term treasuries. So what I think they're hoping for is that creates an inflow of all these short-term treasuries, but it's specifically short-term treasuries, 90-day T-bills, 28-day T-bills, right? Why are they forcing stablecoin issuers to buy short-term stuff instead of the long-term stuff? It's in the Treasury's best interest if people buy 30-year Treasury bonds, right? Because that allows them to lock in for a really, really, really long time. The short-term stuff means that there's interest rate risk. If interest rates go up, they have to refinance that short-term debt a whole lot more frequently. But if it ends up being, the problem with the long-term stuff is if you buy a bunch of 30-year Treasury bonds, and all of a sudden something happens in the bond market, and the value of your bond just tanks because of changes in interest rates, changes in government credibility, all these things. What are you going to do? You're going to say, oh, well, I guess we got to wait 30 years for us to be able to get all of our money back, right? We have to sell at a loss, or we have to wait 30 years to get all of our money back. You can't do that with a stablecoin. You have to maintain constant liquidity. So that's why they say it's short-term, 28-day, 90-day, 180-day T-bills. Those are things that you're allowed to buy. And I think they're hoping that a lot of that money for stablecoins will come from Bitcoin. It'll come from, let's say, the risk assets, Bitcoin, altcoins, et cetera, and from altcoins into stablecoins. But the reality is that a lot of that's going to come from the banking system as well. There's going to be people are going to take US dollar deposits from the banking system, and they're going to move it into stablecoins, right? So that's going to take money out of the banking system. It's going to reduce deposits in the banking system. And the reduction in deposits mean that banks are going to have to sell assets to come up with that liquidity. Banks are going to have to sell. And what are bank assets? What do banks own? Well, they own U.S. government bonds. So banks are going to have to sell.
Longer-term ones.
They own the longer-term ones, right? They own 10-year, 20-year, 30-year bonds. They also do own short-term stuff as well. But you're going to see banks having to sell 5-year notes, 10-year treasury notes to create enough liquidity so they can give the depositors back their money, so the depositors can move their money into the stable coins. Then the stable coins will take that same money and they'll go and buy short-term government bonds. They'll buy these 90-day T-bills, 20-day T-bills. So essentially, in some respects, it sort of screws the Treasury Department a little bit, because the Treasury Department is now going to have to, the Treasury Department wants to sell the longest debt it can, 10-year notes, 20-year bonds, 30-year bonds. Instead, they're going to be trading that stuff out for 28-day T-bills. Banks are going to be selling 30-year bonds so the government can turn around and issue 28-day T-bills to these these altcoins, to these stablecoin issuers, and that's going to actually end up being a problem for the Treasury Department. So there's going to be more money flowing into treasuries, which is a good thing, but in some respects, it's actually going to probably shorten the average maturity curve for U.S. Treasuries, and that's a problem for the federal government. That's a problem for the Treasury Department. So that's why it's not going to solve all their problems.
Did they miss that, or do they have some other goal in mind?
I think this is part of just fulfilling a campaign promise, that Trump wants to be the super pro crypto president. I think the Genius Act does bring money into this, and I think they view that as a good thing. I also think they want to focus on, America, the innovator, America, look at us, we're doing all these innovative things, and I think that's cool. My view, and you and I were talking about this earlier, is that I think crypto is great. I think crypto is great for estate planning, asset protection, your personal freedom, where you can no longer have a middleman between you and your money. I think all those things are great. And yes, it's innovative. It's a lot more innovative than the banking system. The banking system is just, the banking system is just dying. I've talked about this before. It's astonishing how some of the most critical components of the global banking system are still using Windows 7. You've got ATM machines that still use Windows XP. It's like you got banking systems that were written in COBOL and Fortran and these like ancient programming languages that nobody's even heard of anymore. It's a joke. So yeah, like that stuff, it should be disrupted, and anything is more innovative than that. However, I also don't think that widespread crypto adoption is going to move the needle on U.S. economic productivity. That's the reality of the situation. That like if all of a sudden we're all transacting in stable coins instead of the banking system, yeah, maybe there's a little bit more efficiency and maybe a little bit less wasted time, and maybe there's labor that can be better allocated in other industries, et cetera. But I don't see this huge productivity boom in crypto as we would have, for example, in AI or widespread adoption of nuclear power or a lot of other emerging technologies, robotics, et cetera. You have a nuclear powered, small scale nuclear reactor powered robotic AI, driverless taxi, type revolution. The productivity gains in the economy are so much greater than all of a sudden we're all using crypto. I just don't see the economic gains there. I see the personal freedom gains and a lot of benefit. I think that's fantastic, but I don't see widespread economic gain, and I don't think that's really part of it.
We had a question from a reader that was wondering if the stablecoins would be a way to diversify outside of the US dollar.
Would stablecoins be a way to diversify out of the US dollar? No, not with a US dollar stablecoin. Because the reality is, under the Genius Act, a US dollar stablecoin is going to be, the issuer of that stablecoin is going to be a US company, US regulated entity, which it's not right now. That's the thing. Like crypto was always the, kind of the Wild West. There was not really any regulation. And so it was all about, it was a trust ecosystem. I had to trust the issuer. I had to trust the counterparty, including even like the person you're dealing with. You didn't necessarily even have to know, let alone trust that person. But the issuer, if anybody's got half a brain, before they go and load up on some altcoin, they're going to want to understand it. They're going to want to know who's behind this. They might look at the code if they have those skills, et cetera. And, so it was based on trust, and now it's going to be based on a regulatory framework. And what you're going to see once the Genius Act gets passed, and I think almost certainly it will, is you're going to see all these different agencies. You're going to see agencies that aren't really part of the Genius Act, or maybe have a small part of it, just sink their little clenches into stablecoins. And you're going to see the Elizabeth Warrens of the world and Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and all these kind of leftist agencies start encroaching more and more into stablecoins. And my concern is that if you fast forward 5 to 10 years, stablecoins are really going to suck, because there's just going to be so much bureaucracy behind them. Because once you start that, there's really never been an instance in the history of regulations where you start regulating something and then later on they start reducing all that stuff. They build it and build it and build it and build it, build it. Maybe at a certain point they go, oh, we need to deregulate a little bit. but it's like they start the deregulation from a really, really high point. And so my guess is that you project forward a few years, it could be just as crappy as banking is today. And that's going to be a problem. And that's not what it is. Stablecoins today, crypto in general, it is, very much, buyer beware, but you have a lot of freedom. And now it's going to be US agencies issuing US denominated stablecoins backed by US domiciled assets. That's not a way to diversify anything really out of the US dollar. It makes it easier to hold US dollars without a middleman, right? Because you can self custody your stablecoin asset, but you're still completely exposed to the US dollar. And all the things, if the US dollar goes, has a really nasty inflationary episode, guess what? So is your stable coin is going to have the same problem. If your government becomes very confiscatory and decides they want to go and all the civil asset forfeiture or whatever, and people find out, oh yeah, Joe's got all this stable coin, well, guess what? It's all getting frozen because they can lean on the issuer, which is a US company with US regulators, and all this stuff's going to get frozen. And all these things. So from an asset protection perspective, it doesn't make any sense. From a inflation hedge perspective, it doesn't make sense. So it makes sense from a personal freedom, self-custody. I don't have to deal with the banking system anymore, but it doesn't really make sense as a long-term sort of hedge to diversify away from the US dollar.
Thanks for those insights, James.